As we begin, a word of thanks to all who have organized our conference, to all attending, and a special word of gratitude to those presenting. What an honor it is to join you today. Any theology of migration must draw upon the rich heritage of Roman Catholic social teaching, as well as the specific demands of Christian discipleship. In my remarks today, I will touch upon both. Lamenting the deaths of migrants at Lampedusa in Italy, Pope Francis recalls the words of God to Cain in Genesis. God is asking each of us, where is the blood of your brother, which cries out to me? Today, says Francis, no one in our world feels responsible. We have fallen into the hypocrisy of the priest and the Levite, whom Jesus described in the parable of the Good Samaritan. In this globalized world, we have fallen into globalized indifference. In passing over to the side of the forcibly displaced, like the Good Samaritan, the Church today poses three questions for us in its social teaching. The first, whose equal dignity and equal human rights are unequally threatened or denied? The second, what are the best means of general systemic redress, of securing the rights of the forcibly displaced? And the third, what are the best means of specific redress, of securing their special rights, such as the right to asylum? These three distinct yet related questions reveal the place of displacement in an ethics of integral humanism, one that is only imperfectly realized in international law, whose equal rights are unequally threatened. Albert Camus once said that life is not tragic merely because it is wretched. And yet in our world today, for so many, the suffering of the forcibly displaced is no more than an unimportant failure of global politics. Faced with the reality of statelessness, we see and pass on. For like that nameless half-dead stranger in Luke's parable, our world, in the words of Hannah Arendt, sees nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. Indeed, rights Arendt, our very right to have rights, typically depends on membership in a particular national, ethnic, racial, or religious community, so that the loss of home and political status is tantamount to expulsion from humanity altogether. The alien becomes not the exemplar of humanity, but a frightening symbol of difference as such. Is it surprising then that we speak of illegal aliens whose very bodies and not behavior become illegal? Our first question then reveals the fundamental role of human rights in Roman Catholic social teaching in letting us imagine otherwise, letting us see forcible displacement as a betrayal of the human community that is present in each of us. Dignity is always realized in solidarity, in belonging to moral community. And to be forcibly displaced, to be denied your place in the world, is to be effaced, divested of legal and even moral standing. As Arendt foresaw, the crisis of refugees then is finally a crisis of human rights, the very title refugee signifying the systemic deprivation of rights. And yet the crisis of rights extends beyond official legal recognition. Internally displaced persons, migrants fleeing famine, generalized violence, systemic deprivation, those excluded from the strict formal protections afforded refugees, these too are victims of rights violations. And so our second question, what are the best means of general systemic redress? For basic rights impose correlative duties of both forbearance and of performance, that is, of protection and provision. And duties migrate before persons do. Where interstate protections fail, leading to forced displacement, duties correlative to basic human rights persist, but falling now upon the community of states. The concrete universality of citizenship, guaranteeing human rights, binds us in a family of solidarities, privileging those most vulnerable. And always we must think of women and children. An integral rights regime then would address the complex push factors impelling migration, not only the well-founded fear of persecution, but generalized violence, especially gender-based violence, famine, disease, environmental degradation. Rights and duties hang together. Thus, to threaten any basic human right imperils all. The systemic violation of security rights underlying forced migration threatens subsistence and curtails liberty. And basic rights are further exacerbated as those forced to migrate face violence, sexual assault, and insecurity, perils exacerbated as receiving countries seek to deter asylum seekers by closing their borders. The litany of deaths lamented by Pope Francis extends now from Lampedusa to the southern borders of my own country. Refugees and internally displaced persons, especially those in protracted refugee situations like Kakuma, where I serve, are often systemically deprived of basic subsistence rights. And so our third question, what are the best means of specific redress? For refugees' right to have rights must indeed be secured through systemic general redress of our international refugee regime, but we must also address the consequences of denying such rights. For the first right of a refugee, after all, is not to become one. The forcibly displaced, that is, claim specific rights just because they are forcibly displaced. And foremost among such rights in international refugee law, although restricted to those formally designated as refugees or asylees, is that of non-refoulement. Refugees cannot be forcibly repatriated to a country where there's a reasonable expectation of persecution. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights guarantees this, yet neither the 1951 Refugee Convention nor the 67 Protocol imposes a correlative duty upon states to grant it. Indeed, as primary respondents of basic rights claims, states often summarily dismiss asylum claims, even though non-refoulement remains a fundamental non-derogative right, one that cannot be curtailed. Interdiction in international waters, extraterritorial processing, indefinite detention further erode asylees' basic security. Thus, an integral and a comprehensive human rights regime would extend the refugee regime to encompass victims of generalized violence or famine. The graduated urgency of basic rights, correlative duties, this shows us the shape, the lineaments of a just immigration and refugee policy, integrating systemic and special redress. Where morally borders remain porous, international and domestic law should take due cognizance of the moral priority of relative need, the gravity, the imminence of harm, particular vulnerabilities of women, children, members of the LGBT community, familial relationships, complicity of the host country in generating refugee flows, historical, cultural patterns of affiliation, and an equitable distribution of burdens among countries offering asylum. Finally, consistent with our Roman Catholic social teaching, an integral and a comprehensive rights regime would entail equitable policies of voluntary repatriation, reintegration, and rehabilitation, with particular attention to the rights of widows and unaccompanied women and children, the most vulnerable. Hospitable treatment of those seeking to change nationality, whether through local integration in the host country, resettlement in a third country, assistance in their integration into a new homeland, respect for their cultural heritage, and recognition of the benefits of hosting, the contribution of migrants and refugees themselves. Above all, there is no place for warehousing refugees or incarcerating those seeking asylum, the criminalization of displacement. As for the prophets of long ago, the well-being of migrants will be a mark of legitimacy and hence of citizenship. A state's democratic self-constitution warranted precisely inasmuch as rights render its borders porous. And now a word about the specific demands of discipleship, hospitality to migrants. For what we hand on is a living word. Leviticus bids us to remember that the stranger or alien in our midst, an alien residing with you in your land, shall not be oppressed. For the alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen. You shall not oppress the alien. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Save for worship of the one God, no command appears more often in the Hebrew Bible. In such lived remembrance, Israel proves her covenant fidelity in the works of justice. For the children of exile, freedom is always bonded, always proven true in the welfare of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the migrant. In times of prosperity, then Israel is summoned to remember that the land was a gift and not a birthright. And so it is in gracious hospitality to the widow, the orphan, the stranger, resident alien, those who are most vulnerable in kinship societies, that Israel realizes her own covenant identity, To oppress the alien, conversely, is no less than betrayal. Israel must ever cherish the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Cultivating the virtue of hospitality for the stranger, then, is no special act of charity as we often think of it today. It is the measure of righteousness and of justice. It is the believer's token of belonging. And for Christian too, memory speaks. Jesus begins his prophetic ministry in the words of the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because God has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, an invitation and a demand extended throughout history to every disciple. For the heart of Christian ethics is the law of love. As a scripture scholar, Wolfgang Schrage says, love does not follow the dictates of convention and prejudice, but dares to ignore them, dares with sovereign freedom to surmount the barriers that separate people. A person who loves can see in anyone a neighbor in need, only in solidarity with the stranger. Like that man fallen among thieves, stripped of title, status, and role, do disciples prove themselves faithful to the covenantal demands of love. The disciple must see and have compassion, even as compassion itself, suffering with, becomes our way of seeing the stranger in all her truth. And as so often in the parables, Jesus turns the table on the questioner. For while the lawyer seeks to set the limits of love by asking who is or is not his neighbor, Jesus asks who became neighbor. And the question becomes a command, go and do likewise. For Christians, this means that one must become a neighbor, pass over to the side of the suffering stranger. For Gustavo Gutierrez, being a neighbor is to place oneself in the journey of the stranger. And the journey is our story, the gospel in which we are strangers no longer, but in the words of Ephesians, fellow citizens and saints in the household of God. And this, my friends, makes all the difference. Because not surprisingly, then, Christian hospitality to strangers and aliens is at the very heart of our discipleship. In Donald Senior's words, Jesus begins his earthly journey as a migrant and as a displaced person. Jesus, who in the same gospel would radically identify with the least and make hospitality to the stranger a criterion of judgment. And for Luke, with saving irony, seeing and having compassion for these least, the naked, half-dead stranger on our way, marks the way of eternal life. Luke's narrative reveals the boundless universal scope of love precisely in demanding a moral solidarity with those who suffer. Again and again, in the image of the eschatological feast, hospitality is offered not to kin and kind, but to those whose only claim is vulnerability and need. For disciples of the way, such displacement becomes the place of revelation. Hebrews recalls the revelatory hospitality of Sarah and Abraham at Mamre in Genesis. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. And in the Synoptic Gospels, the image of a feast for all peoples reveals God powerfully and eschatologically as Israel's host, a fundamental theme recalled in the eschatological memory of our Eucharist. For disciples, then, the migrant is never the mere object of pity or a policy of assimilation, but a source of blessing. Indeed, both host and guest are transformed as the alien who resides with you is treated as the citizen, the native born. Like Israel of exile, our Samaritan church must become what it has never been before, a new creation, born of suffering, yes, but more of resilience and of hope, even hoping against hope. As strangers and foreigners on earth, Senior notes, Christians seek a better homeland, the world-affirming reign of God. And for Matthew, as for Luke, such hospitality, transforming host and guest, becomes the very condition of salvation. I was a stranger, unrecognized, and you welcome me. In Pope Francis's words, every stranger who knocks at our door is an opportunity for an encounter with Jesus Christ, who identifies with the welcomed and rejected strangers of every age. In the parable of the final judgment, the disciple passes over from being host to guest at the final judgment, the eschatological feast. In loving, one comes to see oneself as beloved. And so grace does what seems to outstrip our human possibility, we pass over to the crucified and the risen one who has first passed over to us in Jesus. As Augustine wrote, Christ is our good Samaritan, coming to the aid of our wounded humanity. Thank you, and may God bless you all.